Breaking news, it is CBS Sports HQ. Our own Jason La Canfora is reporting the Bears are planning to move on from head coach Matt Nagy following Sunday's game against the Vikings. Chicago enters that game 6-10. And what a fall from grace for Matt Nagy. Was coach of the year in 2018, led the Bears to their first NFC North title since 2010. Since then, he's gone 34-30. His play calling being questioned. His development of Justin Fields being questioned. They're going to miss the playoffs this year. Again, they enter this game 6-10 on Sunday against the Vikings. Chicago now with looking at a fifth different head coach in 2012. They had Lovie Smith, Mark Trestman, John Fox, Nagy, and then whoever else is next. But they have not found someone that could lead that offense, ultimately get them back to glory. Look, they thought they had the right guy in 2018, and it looked great. They had the celebration, the post-game room, felt like a club in there. It was a lot of fun in Chicago in 2018. 12-4, lost in the wild card game, though. So didn't meet expectations, and they just have not been good enough for that team. And Matt Nagy not helping his cause this season with the misuse of Justin Fields. All right, here with CBS Sports HQ NFL analyst Ryan Wilson. This is no surprise that Chicago is going to be moving on from Matt Nagy. This felt like a foregone conclusion once Sunday's game was completed. How did we get to this point?
Sort of touched on it. It all comes down to Justin Fields, and prior to Justin Fields, it came down to Mitch Trubisky. You mentioned the 12-4 start in 2018, earned him Coach of the Year honors, and deservedly so. And then you had a couple of mediocre campaigns. Mitchell Trubisky moved on. He's now in Buffalo. You drafted Justin Fields. You traded up to get him. And the understanding was when Matt Nagy arrived from Kansas City that he was sort of Andy Reid's version of the quarterback whisperer, and it just hasn't played out. You mentioned the play calling, Akeem, and that had always been a point of contention, not just this season where it felt like Justin Fields was set up to fail, but in previous seasons when Mitchell Trubisky didn't reach his potential as a top 5 pick. Now, listen, Matt Nagy didn't draft Mitchell Trubisky, but he certainly convinced ownership and GM Ryan Pace that he could make it work. It didn't happen, and you mentioned the 34-30 overall record. That actually looks pretty good if you're a Bears fan, if you just look at the bottom line, but the way they got here is certainly concerning. So whoever ends up being Matt Nagy's successor, the first question will be, all right, how are you going to fix Justin Fields? And the answer might be something like, well, I won't cut or trade my offensive lineman just before the season starts. Again, not entirely Matt Nagy's fault, but there's nothing you can do about that now. One game left in the regular season, and once again, the Bears are missing the playoffs.
If they had made the playoffs, there was a scenario if they had made the playoffs, would that even been good enough to save his job?
That's a great question, but we see it all the time where the mediocrity gets you to a point, right, and ownership is like, okay, we did this. All we need to do, move a few more pieces around, deck chairs around, if you will, on the Titanic and save this thing. So it's not great for Matt Nagy. It's a terrible situation for him, but in terms of the organization, it's probably a step in the right direction. The question now becomes, Akeem, what happens to Ryan Pace, who was there before Nagy got there, and what happens most importantly to Justin Fields? Are
you surprised at the fall from grace? Because, I mean, look, this looked great in 2018, right? They had a disco ball in their locker room in 2018. Right. They're celebrating. They win the division for the first time since 2010. Like, everything looked great, and then 3 subpar seasons. Look, I know they got in the playoffs, and they're not going to make the playoffs this year, but, I mean, what a fall from grace from a guy like Matt Nagy. And everybody was lauding his play calling coming in, right? That was the idea that he was going to be, like, the coach that kind of takes the Bears, gets them to be competitive again.
I think the disconnect, I don't know if I'd call it, what's the word you used, a fall from grace. I wouldn't go that far, but only because if you look at just the record, 12-4, 8-8, and then 6-10, all right, that ain't terrible. And we see, I think that's probably more than anything, Akeem, is average. We see coaches sometimes get off to pretty good starts and then sort of stumble, and 3 or 4 years they're out the door, and we forget about what happened when they were hired. But to your point about Matt Nagy being a legitimate play caller, Andy Reid coaching tree, it just didn't happen. And I think the biggest takeaway for me, and the more I do this, the more this sort of sticks in my mind, is that just because you're a good coordinator doesn't translate to you being a good head coach. It's a completely different skill set. You're managing a bunch of other people. You're not calling plays. You're not game planning. And you have to make everyone put them on the same page, bring them together, be a leader, all those things you hear about. And Matt Nagy just wasn't able to do that. And we saw it live in national television on those primetime games, where the offensive line didn't have a clue, and Justin Fields, through no fault of his own, had very little chance of success as a rookie.
I know you disagree with the fall from grace, but in Chicago,
right,
in certain cities, NFL cities, 8-8 ain't good enough. Back-to-back 8-8s are not good enough, especially considering where they were at in 2018 and where they had built that team, that roster, the 12-4 record, a division title, and then subpar 8-8, 8. You can't tell me that Bears fans are sitting there going, what are we doing here? We just hired this guy. We thought we were going to go compete for an NFC championship, maybe get to a Super Bowl. We got a roster that maybe could get there.
We work with Bears fans who will very clearly defend the words that you're saying, because the expectation is that you win football games. If you go out and hire a guy, again, from the Andy Reid coaching tree, who Andy Reid said only laudatory things about, the expectations are certainly much higher than what we saw. And again, to your point, Akeem, the 8-8 records, some of that masks, some of those wins weren't legitimate wins, you could argue, and maybe those teams were worse than their 500 records reflected. And Matt Nagy did a worse job, if you actually watched him, than just looking at the stat line. And that's certainly a fair complaint. And the success wasn't there. And what Matt Nagy was supposed to bring from Kansas City never really materialized beyond that first season. And even in that first season, they went to the wild card round after winning 12 games and lost promptly to the Eagles. So I don't even know if this is an attractive job offer is the thing, Akeem. There's a lot of work to be done. There are issues on both sides of the ball, primarily on offense, and you have to figure out a way to keep Justin Fields upright, get his confidence back, and help him progress in year two, when the reality is a lot of rookie quarterbacks struggled this year, and Justin Fields was pretty close to the top of that list.
Unfortunately, the Bears checked out a club dub after 2018, back-to-back 8-8 seasons. Look, no matter what happens on Sunday, Matt Nagy is going to walk away as a winning head coach in his Bears tenure. So you look at that, okay, all right, I got it. He won more games than he lost, but he didn't meet expectations, and especially this season with Justin Fields. How does that impact him now? He'll have a second head coach in 2 years.
It's not great. I mean, for lack of a better, more incisive conversation on it, I mean, the idea is that you progress as a rookie, and Matt Nagy made it clear back in August that Andy Dalton was going to be his guy, and Andy Dalton played a couple games, got banged up. Justin Fields came in, wasn't wholly prepared. He had some flashing moments. He played really well in that Steelers primetime game, but he had plenty of other games where he was running for his life, taking unnecessary hits, missing receivers, and that's not uncommon for rookie quarterbacks. But the atmosphere wasn't great for a rookie quarterback. You can say the same thing about Justin Fields in Jacksonville, certainly Zach Wilson in New York with the Jets. And the perfect landing spot, this is also something that we have to keep in mind. When you draft a quarterback, he doesn't magically fix everything. Justin Fields, they traded for him. He was well worth the trade-up. He's that type of player. But if there's nothing around him in terms of an offensive line in particular, he's going to struggle. David Montgomery's a great player. Allen Robinson had what could probably be considered a down year, but there are playmakers at the skill positions there. It's just that the offensive line wasn't able to sustain any sort of pass blocking, and we saw the results with Justin Fields usually picking himself off the turf.
Look, you pointed out right there, Trevor Lawrence is going to have a second head coach in 2 years. We saw Baker Mayfield struggling. He's had 3 head coaches in 3 seasons. It's not going to be great for Justin Fields to have another different head coach, but there's hope that the idea that this next head coach comes in and builds a game plan around his talents, running the football, having a little bit more run-pass option. To me, I guess, it's not great that Justin Fields has to be under another head coach, but at least there's optimism now that things might change.
No, that's a great point. The word of the street is that Vic Fangio will probably be out of a job in Denver. He will not be out of a job very long because he'll be a defensive coordinator. The word on the street also is that Matt Nagy was calling the plays in Chicago. It may hinder his chance to get another job if he's not calling the plays as you might want him to, and he certainly didn't do that in Chicago. And I think your point's a good one, Akeem. You bring someone in who understands the personnel, doesn't try to shoehorn a system that doesn't fit the guys that you have on the roster, and then you go from there. I don't want to say it's going to be a quick fix or an easy fix, but you could see progress if you build that offense around what Justin Fields did successfully at Ohio State and did it successfully at a high level, as opposed to your version of an offense that never seemed to quite work in Chicago, even when they were winning all those football games in 2018.
All right, some names that come to mind in terms of next candidates. Josh McDaniels, Eric Bieniemy, of course. Those names always are popping up. Who might be a name or two that you would consider here to come to Chicago and resuscitate this organization?
I would imagine you would want an offensive name. That seems to be what teams are doing now, although there are exceptions. Brandon Staley has had a ton of success as a defensive coordinator, now the Chargers' first-year head coach. But you mentioned Bieniemy, you mentioned Josh McDaniels. I don't know if that job is going to be enticing enough for Josh McDaniels. We'll see. But also Byron Leftwich will be in the conversation, the young the offensive coordinator for the Buccaneers. There's also Jim Caldwell, who's going to be interviewing for some jobs. He's been around forever, but he's a great offensive mind, had a ton of success in Detroit, an organization that has very little success. And maybe Kellen Moore is also a name to keep in mind, the young offensive coordinator in Dallas, who has some interviews lined up as well. But again, I'll just reiterate this and probably say this until I'm blue in the face. You have to make sure during this interview process that while this person may be a great play caller on offense or defense, they can also have the organizational skills to bring everyone together and have a plan, implement the plan, and have everyone buy in. Because if you don't have that, Akeem, you're sort of wasting your time.
Well, it was certainly a foregone conclusion as the season carried on, but now it is becoming closer and closer into focus here. Jason La Canfora reporting the Bears are planning to move on from head coach Matt Nagy following Sunday's game against the Vikings. Ryan Wilson here on CBS Sports HQ for us with his insight. Again, it started off awesome for the Bears. Club dub. They're celebrating after wins. They win the NFC North for the first time since 2010, albeit they lost in the wild card game to the Philadelphia Eagles. 8-8, another season followed by another 8-8 season. Got in the wild card game, lost to the Saints. Then this year, 6-10. Justin Fields, some misuse of his talents, you could argue, under Matt Nagy. It all adds up to a winning record for Matt Nagy, but not a winning situation for Chicago. And again, they'll be entering 2022 with their 5th different head coach since 2012.